For thousands of years before the railroads, before the steel plow or the barbed wire fence, the central plains of North America rolled out in endless waves of grass. The wind moved like water across that sea, carrying the thunder of hooves. These were the buffalo lands, the beating heart of an entire continent, and in that rhythm of hooves and wind, countless indigenous nations found life, order, and identity. The Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Blackfeet, and dozens more shaped their cultures around the movement of the bison. The great herds fed them, clothed them, and tied them to every cycle of nature. A single buffalo could sustain a family, meat dried into pemmican for winter, hides tanned for teepees and clothing, sinew for bowstrings, bones for tools, horns for cups and spoons. Nothing was wasted. In ceremony, the buffalo was not only food but spirit, an ancestor who offered itself so that people might live. The buffalo hunt was surrounded by prayer, song, and gratitude. Every spear thrust or arrow release was guided by ritual respect. The health of the herds meant the health of the people, and when the animals moved north or south, entire nations followed. When Europeans first reached the edges of the Great Plains in the 17th century, they encountered this powerful balance of life. The Spanish brought horses from Mexico, and by the early 1700s those animals had spread far beyond their control, transforming the plains. Horses gave mobility to tribes that once moved on foot. They turned buffalo hunting into an art of speed and coordination. The Comanche in the south and the Lakota in the north became masters of mounted warfare and hunting, building complex societies that relied on the buffalo's migrations. For nearly 2 centuries, this world endured even as fur traders and missionaries began to appear along the rivers. The Hudson's Bay Company, the French voyageurs, and later American traders entered the plains seeking beaver pelts and later buffalo hides. Trade brought metal tools, firearms, beads, and cloth, but also disease. Smallpox and cholera carved deep wounds through native communities. Yet even as population loss struck, the buffalo still offered stability. As long as the herds moved, there was hope. By the early 19th century, the United States was expanding west of the Mississippi. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 opened vast new territories to settlers and soldiers. Lewis and Clark's expedition mapped rivers lined with buffalo so dense the explorers described them as black as the land itself. But as steamboats carried trade up the Missouri, a subtle shift began. Market demand in the east turned the buffalo from a sacred being into a commodity. Traders encouraged native hunters to take more hides, and factories in St. Louis began processing robes for sale to wealthy Americans and Europeans. The shift from subsistence to market hunting marked the first crack in the ancient balance. Where once a hunt. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States turned its attention westward with the same energy it had once poured into battlefields along the Mississippi. Steel rails crept across the prairies, binding the nation with commerce and ambition. The great herds of buffalo, still numbering in the tens of millions, became an obstacle to this new vision of empire. To railroad engineers, the animals were a menace that stopped trains and destroyed track beds. To industrialists and leather merchants, they were a fortune in hides waiting to be claimed. To army officers charged with pacifying the plains, the herds were the last shield protecting independent native nations. The logic took shape in a few cruel words that echoed through military reports: no bison, no food. By 1870 the herds had already begun to split into 2 great populations, the northern and southern plains herds. The southern herds ranged from Kansas through Texas, the northern stretched across the Dakotas, Montana, and into Canada. The southern plains were the first to fall. A new tanning process in Europe had made buffalo hides suitable for machine belts in factories, and within months a wave of professional hunters poured west. They carried Sharps rifles capable of dropping a buffalo from half a mile away. Each man could kill 100 animals in a day. At the railheads in Dodge City, Hayes, and Abilene, the hides piled up like mountains, waiting for shipment east. The meat was left to rot. Within a few years, bones whitened the prairie, later gathered and sold by the ton for fertilizer. The army looked on with approval. General Philip Sheridan, who had fought in the Civil War, told Congress that every buffalo destroyed was an Indian gone hungry. Commanders along the frontier quietly encouraged the slaughter, knowing that starving people would be easier to drive onto reservations. Civilian hunters such as William "Buffalo Bill" Cody became national celebrities, celebrated in newspapers for feats that in truth marked an ecological catastrophe. For the tribes of the Southern Plains, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne, the disappearance of the herd struck like drought after plenty. Their entire economy collapsed in less than a decade. Raiding for horses or cattle could not replace the loss of millions of buffalo. Hunger spread through winter camps, and U.S. officials used the promise of government rations as leverage in treaty negotiations. By the mid-1870s, most Southern tribes had been forced onto reservations in Indian Territory, their independence traded for survival. Meanwhile, the Northern Plains still echoed with the rumble of hooves. The Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Blackfeet held on to their hunting grounds across the Powder River and Yellowstone country. They saw what had happened farther south and vowed that it would not happen to them. Leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse resisted U.S. intrusion, and the northern herd. When the 1880s closed, the plains lay quiet. Bones, not herds, marked the old migration trails. Railroad towns stood where camps and wallows once spread. To many who lived through it, the silence felt like the end of the world. In that silence, Native communities struggled to rebuild life within reservation lines, tilling dry soil, drawing rations, and enduring policies that sought to erase memory itself. The buffalo's disappearance was more than loss of food, it was the breaking of a covenant that had bound people, animals, and land together. At the same time, a few voices outside Indian country began to recognize what had happened. Naturalists, soldiers, and ranchers who had witnessed the destruction could not forget the emptiness that followed. Men such as William Hornaday, Charles Goodnight, and Frederick Dupree captured surviving calves and started small private herds. Their motives varied, some out of scientific curiosity, others from nostalgia or pride, but without them the species might truly have vanished. By 1890 perhaps 500 bison remained in the United States and Canada. For Native nations, recovery meant something deeper than species preservation. The buffalo was kin. Stories told that the people and the buffalo had once promised to care for each other. If humans honored the herds would sustain the humans. In the years of confinement, spiritual leaders reminded their communities of that promise. The ghost dance religion of the 1890s carried the dream that the buffalo would return and the earth would heal. When soldiers killed more than 200 Lakota at Wounded Knee in 1890, they ended that particular movement, but not the longing behind it. The new century opened with the bison standing on the edge of oblivion but not falling over it. Yellowstone National Park protected a tiny wild herd. The Bronx Zoo and Canadian parks began breeding programs. In 1913, Yellowstone released 15 zoo-born animals back to the open range, a symbolic turning point. Yet for Native peoples the herds were still out of reach, fenced within government lands or private ranches. They watched outsiders celebrate the rescue of the buffalo even as reservations remained stripped of the resources that had once supported those animals naturally. During the 1920s and 1930s, the language of conservation slowly widened. Some officials in the Bureau of Indian Affairs realized that restoring buffalo herds could help supply meat to reservations. Small groups of animals were returned to tribal lands such as the Flathead Reservation in Montana and Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. Elders greeted the first calves with ceremony, sprinkling tobacco and singing the old songs of gratitude. Still, the numbers were tiny compared to the seas of life that once rolled across the prairie. World War II and the post-war boom pushed the story into the background. America celebrated modern progress, tractors,